And we'll be talking about the outcome or the essence of the BRICS summit with a special guest as well a little later in the show. But let's also tell you what else has happened in the backdrop of the BRICS summit. Well, the BRICS summit in Kazan has also proved to be the backdrop of a major bilateral meeting between India and China. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and China's President Xi Jinping have had their first formal bilateral meeting after a gap of 5 years, just a day after the two sides had a breakthrough agreement on disengagement of troops on the border as the relationship had been put into reverse gear following the 2020 Galwan clashes. Here's what happened.
A much-anticipated meeting between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping took place in Russia's Kazan on the sidelines of the 16th BRICS summit on Wednesday. Although the two leaders last met informally in 2023 in Johannesburg on the sidelines of the previous BRICS summit, a formal meeting between the two leaders had only taken place 5 years ago in India's Mahabalipuram. Referring to the meeting, the Indian Prime Minister posted on X, "Met President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Kazan BRICS summit. India-China relations are important for the people of our countries and for regional and global peace and stability. Mutual trust, mutual respect and mutual sensitivity will guide bilateral relations." The first India-China bilateral after 2019 took place just a day after an agreement between the two Asian emerging economies on disengagement at the de facto border between the two nations. A decision to come up with patrolling arrangements on the line of actual control was also announced on Tuesday, which would revert the situation on the border to how it was prior to the 2020 summer clashes between the armies of the two sides. India's Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri briefed the media after the meeting as to how the ties would be taken forward now.
They instructed the special representatives to meet at an early date and to continue their efforts in this regard. You may recall that Special Representative of India, Mr. Ajit Doval, who is also the National Security Advisor, and the Special Representative of the People's Republic of China, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, also a member of the Politburo, have met on the sidelines of international events, but they have not had a round of talks in the Special Representatives format since December 2019. So following today's meeting, we hope to schedule the next round of the SR's talks at an appropriate date.
The Foreign Secretary also elaborated on future course of action.
The restoration of peace and tranquility in the border areas will create space for returning us towards the path of normalization of our bilateral relations. Officials will now take the next steps to discuss enhancing strategic communication and stabilizing bilateral relations by utilizing the relevant official bilateral dialogue mechanisms, including at the level of our respective foreign ministers.
Over the last 10 years, India-China relations have been through a roller coaster ride. From the highs of President Xi's 2014 state visit to Prime Minister Modi's reciprocal China visit the next year. There were also landmark informal visits in Wuhan and Chennai. But the 2020 Galwan clash in eastern Ladakh made India not only hit the brakes, but also put relations on key fronts like investments in reverse gear. Now another shift has been made to get the relationship moving forward, which could decide the future of the fabled Asian century. Gautam Roy's report, DD India.
Okay, let's talk about this a little further. We're joined by not only my colleague Jessica Taneja from Kazan live with us, but also got our expert guests with us. We've joined by Dr. Madan, Senior Fellow of the Brookings Institution from Washington, D.C. Good evening to you. And Professor Swaran Singh of the School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi also joins us. Jessica, let me come to you first and ask you, if I were to borrow from Chinese parlance, has this long-awaited meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi delivered a win-win result for both neighbours, or will the proof of the pudding be in the eating? Jessica, could you hear me? I think we have an issue connecting with Jessica at the moment. Let me come to you, Tanvi Madan. What do you make of...
report also highlights
okay, I think there was a delay.
Yes, Gautam, I can hear you. It's a step in the right.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Right, Gautam. Picking up from your report, it is important that the BRICS summit concludes with a meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a bilateral meeting that hasn't taken place since the last 5 years, ever since the standoff of 2020. Well, the groundwork was laid much before the Prime Minister's arrival here at Kazan. You'd recall Foreign Secretary's briefing right before Prime Minister was to reach Russia, and the disengagement at the border, the patrolling areas, the grazing areas were reversed to what they were in 2020. But when asked about confidence-building measures and how does this movement go forward when it comes to the relationship between the two, especially resumption of trade ties, given the fact that China is one of our largest trading partners, and there is a lot of lot of speculation, especially in the business community, on how to resume trade, given the fact that there have been some concerns expressed in the past as well. But this particular development here at Kazan, with Foreign Secretary's emphasis on the fact that peace and tranquility on the border has enabled resumption of bilateral talks. And in fact, if you see the more than 24 military level talks have been held between the two countries' delegations over the years. And finally, we've reached a point where at least there is a breakthrough, but treading with caution, looking at how this trust deficit will build up over the years while talks resume and more working models are introduced to continue those talks between the two nations. Well, that would certainly give us an idea on how the relationship moves forward. But for the moment, it is limited to the fact that while the conflict that we saw at the border continued, but the patrolling points agreed upon would be something. When asked about whether it also includes Demsog and Depchok, the Foreign Secretary said yes, those are also included. Those were also included in the talks. So it is a significant breakthrough, but one will have to see as to how this moves forward, especially when it comes to assurances whether those skirmishes will not particularly hamper the relationship moving forward.
Yes, well, let's hope that there aren't any future skirmishes that we have to talk about, Tanvi. Jessica, let me turn to Tanvi Madan now. Dr. Madan, what do you make of what has happened today when you compare it to the kind of checklist that you had put out on your handle earlier in terms of how fruitful has this meeting been after such a long time?
Thanks, Gautam. It's good to be with all of you. As Ms. Taneja said, I think it is a significant step. But I think as the Foreign Secretary highlighted in his press conference, he talked about it as opening the pathway for a potential restoration of normal ties. But he was very clear that both sides need to to walk that pathway. And so, as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Some of the agreements have been reached. We don't have full details. We will need to see what exactly the agreements are to the extent that they are announced. We will need to see what the Chinese say. There was no joint statement. What does Beijing say about what their understanding of the agreement is? And then finally, we'll have to see implementation of these agreements. As Mr. Taneja alluded to, we've seen that some of this is, there's a lack of trust. And so that has to be rebuilt. And the only thing that will create that reassurance is if now these modalities are worked out, but also if there's implementation on the ground. This is just the first step. It's an important step, the disengagement, but it's just the first step in what's going to be a long journey.
Yes, certainly. What do you make of it, Professor Swaran Singh? Because the Foreign Secretary in his briefing also said that very soon there will be a meeting of the special representatives at an earliest possible date, and possibly when you talk about overall ties, even the foreign ministers of the two countries could meet within a span of even this calendar year.
Gautam, China and India have been negotiating border from late 1980s, 1988 to be specific. And that underlines the complexity of the issue of this world's largest disputed boundary between world's two largest population countries. And of course, the nature of territory is again very complicated. So first of all, it's not an easy thing. It's not a boundary dispute. It's a dispute of about 138,000 square kilometers of territories, claims and counterclaims. Now, if you look at it, China's approach to neighborhood, which is usually known as 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, it tried that with India. It hasn't worked. Then it tried that, to see who blinks first. With both armed forces deployed eyeball to eyeball in many places, India has stood firmly for 4.5 years. And India is the only example in the neighborhood which has made China to go back to the negotiating table in that sense. Now, how far and how quickly we will move, I think we have to first try to implement what is already agreed upon to achieve, first of all, disengagement and de-escalation. Then, of course, going back to about May 2020 positions, and then restore peace and tranquility chapter, which started in 1988 in that sense. So demarcation of this boundary may happen in 30, 40, 50 years, or we might just forget it, because we might think it is irrelevant to think about demarcating that boundary, which is so complicated and is pulling India and China down. So I think it's a good inflection point, but it's going to be a really, really long journey in the making. And in that sense, I think we have to see how two leaders will move forward from here. I'm not basically so excited about two special representatives meeting soon. They have met earlier 22 times. To me, more important is whether the two leaders had some understanding on reviving their informal summit meetings, which was the most innovative mechanisms that China and India had evolved. And I think that is something which I'm looking forward to see it revived.
Yes, the last one was in Chennai. Now, Jessica, if I could come to you again, and I think we have had to thank Tanvi. She had a previous engagement. But Jessica, have the Chinese said anything about what has transpired between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi so far?
Well, that's all we all are waiting for, Gautam. What does the Chinese MOFA has to say about the meeting between their president and our prime minister? Because it's important to note what line do they take and what details do they mention, especially about the patrolling areas and the disengagement that we talk about. Now, remember, the clashes that started was also because of the status quo that existed before the Chinese side started patrolling on areas which were particularly earmarked for India. So that friction, the resolution or the solution to that friction point is something we'd have to wait and see. And also, what are those agreements, as Tanvi was also pointing out just a short while ago? We'll have to see what exactly has China agreed to, because although the talks look significant, but we'll have to see what the Chinese side, what they put out as something that they would affirm to or commit to, because that would lay the ground for reducing the trust deficit between the two countries. While we've heard from our side that there were constructive talks, now that peace and tranquility on the border would remain, but resumption of commercial flights between the two countries and enhancing of trade ties, perhaps more Chinese investment in India. You'd recall the economic survey just earlier this year. It had mentioned China almost 36 times, and their investment would be crucial in enhancing supply chains across India. And of course, the business community would greatly benefit if the trade ties are normalized. But for India, it would tread with caution, given that China has backtracked many times in the past. And there again, I would reiterate, has been a trust deficit between the two nations. And India maintaining the stance until the time there is no peace on the border areas, trade talks or bilateral relation would not resume. But all of that has right now been taken care of. But at the same time, we'll have to wait and see on what the Chinese MOFA says exactly in terms of how we move forward after these talks, even though brief and constructive. But the operative part is what has China agreed to.
Certainly. Now, Professor Swaran Singh, in the sense that this may be in principle sort of an agreement and modalities will be worked out as things move along, because this will involve the armed armed forces of the two sides as well, because they're the ones who actually do the patrolling, apart from paramilitary forces on the Indian side as well. But do you think that in the sense that India had made it a single point that the relationship can only move forward if the Chinese address this issue and address it effectively, it's been a win for India. India's persistence and insistence on addressing this issue first has made the Chinese cave, which is why we've had first the agreement and now the meeting in Kazan.
Really, as the military stood in those difficult situations and terrain all these 4.5 years, diplomacy sustained that standard argument that relations cannot be normal as long as border is not normal. And therefore, I think India, as I keep saying, is one unique neighbor of China, which has stood up to the pressures of all kinds. And if you look at the body language and the fact that Indian Prime Minister walked into a place when President Xi Jinping was there to welcome him, if I understand, the protocol would indicate that perhaps the meeting was requested by the Chinese side in that sense, which would be an interesting thing to take then, compared to how China behaves with the most of other neighbors, including, in fact, with United.
So why do you think China has been so eager to start normalizing ties with India? Does it have something to do with the kind of economic headwinds that China has been facing? It sees India, as the world sees it, as a great destination for investment and doing business with, and that has been hampered in certain spheres, although trade has blossomed still, and China has, it exports almost double the amount that India exports to China, but still things have not been as great as they could have been.
Surely, I think there could be a whole series of explanations as to why would China be excited to sort of revive normal relations with India. And since you alluded to the economic deceleration of China in last few years, and India's economy growing at 7 and 8%, not just China, much of the countries would think of India as a good investment destination. And looking at the fact that India is likely to become third largest economy, China can easily think of investing $200 or $250 billion in India, provided India is welcoming and willing to take that in. And likewise, the trade can definitely go up to $500 billion, given the fact that both are large economies in that sense. And China understands that potential of India. And second, I think it's also the rising stature of India, the way India is welcomed now increasingly around the world, made China understand that, bullying India is not delivering, is not working on the ground. And, both sides perhaps started realizing what is called mutually hurting stalemate for a long period of time. And in that sense, I do believe that efforts must have been made on both sides. But what I'm underlining is that China's behavior with other countries, you look at how they behaved with Australia, what is called wolf warrior diplomacy. Chinese have never behaved with India in the same fashion, because I think India in that sense is the largest neighbor with its enormous potential, increasing its acceptability around the world in that sense. So Chinese understand that India is not like any other neighbor of theirs, and therefore the way they have to engage with India has to be different. And India's diplomacy, foreign policy has seen also an increasingly assertive tone, whether it is on Russia versus Ukraine issue or it is in Middle East. Indian Prime Minister held a meeting with the new Iranian president, for example. So the new self-confidence of India again must have somewhere made Chinese understand that they perhaps need to evolve much more different and innovative strategy in engaging with India. And in that sense, as your report just said, we don't know the exact, details of what has been agreed on the ground, but it was good enough to have within 72 hours, two national leaders coming face to face and having a delegation level meeting and, giving a clear indication that, we are going to go back to normal relationship with special representatives meeting as soon as possible. So in that sense, I think that this is a kind of an inflection point. I understand Chinese have definitely made a major dent on the way they deal with neighbors, and India has continued to stand by the same narrative of relations not being normal as long as the borders are not normal in that sense. So it could be seen as a bit of a patting our backs in that sense. But we also have to see how it moves forward, because the enormous distrust quotient that is there between China and India. I hope this moves forward as fast as from April.
I guess cautious Optimism will be the byword in the coming months, at least, if not a longer period of time. And if indeed there is disengagement followed by de-escalation at the line of actual control, the de facto border, one perhaps should also wonder where all those troops, the Chinese troops that have been placed there, where will they all go? Will it be a different front? Thank you for joining me for the moment, Professor Swaran Singh and my colleague Jessica Taneja from Kazan in Russia.